I've had a lot of people lately ask me about how do you recharge your creative battery as a writer? What do you do that really keeps you interested in writing, keeps you excited about writing? There's a number of things that you have to take into consideration. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about keeping control of your assets. The greatest asset that a writer has is his brain. That's what you use to write with. I mean, you gotta have your eyes hooked up to it so you can see things. You gotta be able to listen. And as writers, we need to train ourselves to be aware of the world around us. And that means that you need to learn how to see. For example, my poetry teacher in college, Leslie Norris, is a wonderful poet. He's a poet laureate of England. And Leslie pointed out that not everybody learns to see. He said there's several different classes of people who learn to see pretty well and really pay attention to what they see. One class of person that sees really well, he said, was miners. They would go down and work in the coal mines in Wales when he was a kid. And he noticed that when a person came up out of the mines after 2 weeks, they had been so deprived of color and of sight that for most of them it just was overwhelming. It was as if they were seeing the world for the first time each time they came up. And he said they didn't ever grow tired of it. The same was also true of music and listening, because down in the mines there was so little sound that when they came up they were very much aware of bird song, and they were listening intently to what the old lady would say across the fence and this type of thing. We need to train ourselves to see and hear as writers. As a police officer, you get the same kind of training. You have to learn to listen, to see, and then to report upon everything that you've seen and heard. That's just part of what you do as a police officer training. Painters are usually very good at seeing because they recognize that much of what we learn about color is false. For example, when I was a little kid, I would paint scenes of trees, and I would say, my mom, what color's a tree trunk? And she'd say brown. And then you go look at tree trunks, and they aren't brown at all. They're gray and white and splotched and various colors. Sometimes they have purple and black in them, and if a big pine tree gets water on it, it'll turn black, And so you start looking at it and saying, oh, I was doing it wrong when I tried to use brown as my color for tree trunks. I really needed to try to put down my colors and layers and have different hints and hues and tones to my tree trunks. And so I learned to paint things as they really are by seeing them as they really are. And that's what artists have to do. Writers have to do much the same thing. One of the things that I've done as a writer over the years is I do a little experiment in listening. I love to go into a restaurant and find myself a booth and sit there alone and listen to the conversations of the people around me. And you never know what they're going to say. They can be from out of town, out of country. They can be talking about all sorts of topics. I once was eating lunch at a cafeteria in a college back in Oregon, and a fellow came and sat down by me, and somebody came and sat next to him and asked for 20 pounds of marijuana on Friday, and the next person came by and he wanted 4 pounds of methamphetamines by Saturday, and then he was giving them dates and times for pickups and drops and stuff like that. And I was just amazed that they would hold that kind of business, in public. But if you're afraid of getting your phones tapped and you're afraid of people overhearing what you're saying, a loud cafeteria like that was actually a pretty good place for them to handle their business. In another instance, once I was in a very quiet little restaurant down in Provo, Utah, a little ice cream place, and there was a fellow talking about planning on killing his boss in front of his wife, and she's trying to get him to shut up, but he's so mad at his boss that, he's like, no, he deserves to die, and going on and on about it, and, these kinds of things. It's just fun to listen to these kinds of conversations. Another occasion, had a young girl talking to her mother about sexual abuse going on with her stepfather. And another case, had a young lady who was being proposed to by a cowboy, and she was a very sophisticated city woman from Chicago. And it was just kind of funny watching their interaction, her desperately trying to figure out how to get him not to ask the question, and him desperately trying to figure out how to get her to say yes at the same time. So, these little listening exercises can be really helpful. if you do start listening, you'll notice that there's a lot of things that are going on in the world that we don't accurately report on. For example, I was reading a story where birds were chirping in this forest. And I thought, how many birds really chirp in the world? How many birds really chirp? Practically none. You know, there's not very many birds that chirp. They twitter, they tweet, they cluck, they make all sorts of noises. And if you start listening to bird experts, they'll talk about chitters and different churs and twills and all sorts of different noises that we don't have names for normally. But they're trying to figure out, okay, how do you explain the sound that the golden-breasted nuthatch makes when it's hopping around from tree to tree? And there's nothing in the English language, so they have to invent them. And so if you really want to find out what birds sound like, you have to figure out what your forest is like and what birds are going to live there. And then you have to go through and listen to their bird song. You can Google all this stuff and then find out how it's described in the literature. You know, how do they describe this sound that this bird is making? And the same is true with insects and with frogs and these types of things. So we sit down and we have to learn how to see and how to hear if we're going to be able to write these stories well.